Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Liveradinithi and welcome back to the end of the year wrap up. So we have just stepped into the last month of the year, and reading wise it has been a great year, guys. Like not only did I read a lot of books this year, I also managed to read and enjoy most of the books I read, especially since I implemented this strategy where I just stopped impulse buying, and like I made a promise to myself that I would only buy the books that I really want or that I know I'm going to like. So I put in the effort and I did my research. I looked up on the books that I want and sounded interesting, and I looked at reviews or reading blogs of like the people that have similar taste to mine. So for example, like people like Reagan on BookTube and Piera, and of course like my friends Inosh, Aisha, all of them. So whenever I wanted to buy something, I did my research so to make sure that whatever I buy I will end up reading it, that I know I will enjoy. Aside from Bunny by Mona Awad, everything else that I read have been like 4 or 5 stars. I think the books that I gave like 3 stars, 2 stars have been audiobooks. Those are like this randomly, the books that I randomly pick up. Yeah, so aside from that, like all the physical books that I own have been really good, and I've been having like a really good reading year. So hopefully I can take this to next year and do the same thing. And yeah, I'm also proud of myself for like spending wisely, because it's a good feeling. So I'm doing this wrap up at the beginning of this month because I don't plan to read any new books for the month of December, because I really want to reread the They About trilogy. So that's what I'm gonna do in December. So I'm going to wrap up the books that I read in November, and also this one book that I somehow missed out on talking about, which I read like a few months back. So let's get into those books. The first one is Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This is my favorite Oseman book. It's even better than Heartstopper. And if you watch my, I think it was my September wrap up, I did talk about how I didn't really like Loveless as much as Heartstopper, but then I also read this and it's even better. But yeah, so give this 5 out of 5. And not only does this have a very accurate and one of the best representations of platonic relationships, it also has a very underrated and overlooked parent-children dynamic here, which I will get into later. It's about 2 people, Alan and Francis, who become unlikely friends when Francis discovers that the shy, quiet boy who is the best friend of her classmate is the creator of her favorite podcast called Radio Silence. And Francis and Alec build up this beautiful platonic relationship that goes beyond the spectrum of just friends, right? And the thing is, like, it is in no way romantic, and it never will be a romantic relationship, but it is just as intimate and just as important. And this is me speaking from experience, because I have 3 people in my life whom I have this type of relationship with, and of course like none of those relationships are as dramatic as these 2, because of course you have these young adult genre elements enveloped into the story, but the undertones are very relatable. The story mainly focuses on them, their coming of age, discovering the passions in life, and deciding what to do. It was such a beautiful read. Even the secondary characters I really enjoyed, and they were well developed enough, especially Alex's sister, Karis. She only shows up at the end of the book, but she's constantly mentioned throughout this entire story, so that when she appears in the story at like the last few pages or chapters, it doesn't seem like you're being introduced to like a completely new character, because you already know who she is. She is in this story. She is constantly present even though she's not. So characters like that are really important to the story, so I really like how she incorporated like the secondary characters well within the main plot line. Then of course I want to talk about the family dynamics here that I mentioned, especially because you have 2 polar opposites when it comes to these people's families. Like Frances' family and her mother is, she's the supportive, kind, and always on Frances' side, and this loving mother that we all crave for and very few people get to have. And on the other side you see Alice's mother, who is honestly a character or like a type of parent that is like rarely mentioned in books, because their form of abuse is emotional and very toxic, but never leaves a physical mark. So it is often overlooked or like just shrugged off, but the emotional toll it takes on a child when the parent tries to live vicariously their unfulfilled dreams through the child, and Osman handles it really well, especially through Alid and his sister. And of course, like this book captures the essence of being a teenager, being a young adult, you know, like the heightened emotions, your hormones and your insecurities, that overwhelming feeling with school, your friends, your family, all of that she does so well. And yeah, definitely one of my favorite books that I read this year. I highly recommend it, and if you have friends who you can't imagine life without, tell them how much they mean to you. And don't be afraid to tell your friends that you love them. Use the words "I love you" to them because it has power. I give this 5 out of 5, highly recommend. So the next 2 books I read are the Popul and the Dragon Republic. I'm currently reading The Burning God, so I will have a vlog up for that soon. But yeah, these 2 I have like entire vlogs, separate vlogs for this, which I will leave link down below. But I'm going to talk about these 2 together because you can't talk about, you have to take this series as one big story, and like these are just 3 parts because it's very hard to talk about one book, because the Poppy War is essentially a build-up and a setup to the other 2 books, essentially like the rest of the story. Because like without these 500 pages, like the Burning God and like the Dragon Republic, they wouldn't be as good as they are, because she built up like an entire world and characters within this book. And when you move to like the Dragon Republic, it's all set up now and the story takes off. It's such a roller coaster and it's exhausting to read. And also like the Burning God, the setting of the story is war and chaos. It's about this girl called Rin who basically takes this test to go into this elite military academy at like the heart of the city in Sinagad, and there she learns how to basically be a soldier, and she's called to the front lines when the 3rd Poppy War breaks out. And the events of the story is inspired by the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War, which you might have heard already. Everybody talks about the inspiration behind it whenever they talk about the book. And one of the things that this story is so hyped up, and that hype is so well deserved because of how she portrays war. And I'm assuming that's why, or it should be, because the portrayal of war and the brutality of it she does so well. And because never in any of these pages is war romanticized, and she doesn't shy away from writing the horrors of war. Like, we suffered a civil war in this country, we all know how that went, we all still remember it, especially the horrors of war, and of course the international influence and all of that. We also remember it, and the effects of that war is not going to be resolved. Like the aftermath, the fallout will never be resolved in any of our lifetimes, because even now, after so many years, we're still struggling to get back up. So that brutal reality is the essence of this story, because it shows what this kind of war does to the soldiers, the civilians, the government, the politicians, the economy, just all of it. And then you see Rin, who is our main character, going from a local village girl to a student in an academy, to a soldier, to a commander, and then again to a pawn in a power struggle throughout this book, and then to like a commander again, and just basically how her humanity is stripped away every time she is forced to make these horrible decisions. And this book hits you in the face with PTSD, with drug addiction and drug withdrawals and war crimes, and just so much death in very graphic details, none of which is trauma porn, by the way. It is just masterful and brilliant writing, especially the world building and the characters is just incredible. And Rin, of course, is a morally great character. She's an anti-hero, and I like how Kwang kind of gives it the definition that it deserves, the idea of an anti-hero. Because what I've noticed with a lot of books, that even though the hero is an anti-hero, you still expect him to be good. Still, like, it's not a good person doing bad things and he's morally just and all of that, but that is not the definition of an anti-hero, and that is exactly what Rin is. Like, you cannot justify the things that she does, but you also understand. You know why she's doing it, you know the pain she's going through, because you're constantly inside her head, and you know what she is, a product of war. Just like with another character who was introduced in the first book. So he's sort of like the result of the previous wars, and they show how the cycle continues with Rin and her descent into madness. The narrative itself is morally grey, because that is how you make this kind of story authentic, because you cannot, when it comes to war is essentially chaos, and people do the most inhuman and violent things in the name of war, in the name of their country, in the name of their race. There is no right or wrong, regardless of which side you're on. So it's overwhelming, it's exhausting to read, but it is one of the best narratives of war that I've ever read, and it is so authentic to the events that took place in real life. And it's just brilliant storytelling, man. Like, when it comes to these characters, you fall in love with them in the Dragon Republic because of how it was set up in the first book, and you feel for them in the Burning God with how everything ends. Also, this is something I really want this is something I really want to mention, because I love how let's talk about the theme of colonization in this book. Like, R.F. Kuang has literally given white supremacy and colonization a big middle finger, and as we can all agree, it is well deserved. It is actually hilarious how some of these white people that I've seen who've read the book trying and struggling to decipher this story and this history and the countries and what's going on. Not all, but some have, I've noticed. And it is an indictment of the American education system when you can't even figure out which part of the country Rin is from. Because let's face it, this is not a difficult book to understand. If you have at least a little bit of knowledge about the world outside, this is not something that's difficult to understand. Like, because it is written in a way that is so easy and the pacing is so well done. There's not a lot of info dumping. Like, you're basically learning the things like the history and the world as Rin does, because she's in a school, so she is learning all this stuff. It's not that hard. And of course, within the book and within the story, Kuang does not shy away from turning the tables around and describing how unnatural pale white skin is, and how they all look the same to all the people of Nicara. And I have the utmost respect for R.F. Kuang for voicing out the other side of the story, which the history books conveniently leave out. If you haven't picked up these books, you definitely should. They were not as emotional. It didn't bring out this emotional feelings that I thought it would, in terms of, except for Rin and Katai, I didn't really connect with the rest of the characters, but it honestly didn't matter to me, because it was still one of the best books I've read because of the narrative and how important it was and how well it was written. So it's not, even though I didn't cry it still pulled those emotional tethers. The next one I read is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. This is an audiobook that I picked up just randomly because I kept seeing it everywhere to an annoying amount, and it is well deserved the hype. I understand why this book is popular and why this sort of stories are important to be promoted. I gave it 4 out of 5, and to be honest, if I didn't know what this book was about, I would have DNF'd it, because it started off as this very cliche romance novel, and I almost put it down, but Inash was like, no, this is not about that, it's about domestic abuse and about like relationships. So that's why I continued, and I'm so glad I did. Aside from it being a romantic story, because there is that element in it, it is so much more than that. And because I've had a pit in my stomach since I started reading it, this book it's fantastic, and it's kind of cruel to even say that, because it deals with domestic abuse and sexual assault. It's written in a very respectful way, and I'm sure it was really hard for the writer to write this sort of story because of how close to her heart this story is. And the characters is what made this book. Like, I'm just I'm frustrated, I'm heartbroken, and I'm disappointed, like in almost all of them. And I absolutely love the main character and her intelligence. She's an incredible woman and a beautiful character, and she's a resilient human being. All of this makes sense considering that the inspiration for this character was Colleen's mother. And the story itself gives a very important message and a much needed perspective on domestic abuse and sexual assault. I know it's not just me, but I'm really tired of the narrative. If this man is hitting her, why does she not leave him? Why can't she leave? Or how much do you need to, or how much pain do you have to endure before people take you seriously? And is constantly blaming the victim for not leaving her abuser. So instead, let's ask the more important question: if this man loves her, why is he hitting her? Because apologizing after is not an excuse. It doesn't make everything better. This was not an easy read for me, and I doubt it is for a lot of people, so you have to read the trigger warnings before you get into this book, because once the abuse starts and after that tipping point, it doesn't stop, and it's like a constant cycle. So be mindful of that before you read it. And let's not also forget that abuse can come in so many different ways. It is not just physical, it is emotional, and it is not just romantic relationships. It can happen between friends, it can happen between siblings. Abuse is abuse. There's no excuse for that. So the only reason I couldn't give it 5 stars is because of how a certain character got his resolution at the end. Because if you read the story, you know how it ends, and I didn't particularly like how his story was resolved and how it ended, and the kind of freedom that he got for what he did. So yeah, not gonna say more, but you can read the book. But that is why I couldn't give it 5 stars, because I couldn't get behind that. Although I do understand why she wrote it the way she did. It's her prerogative to write it, but yeah, I just couldn't get behind the fact that I think he deserves a harsher punishment. And you should never make anyone make you feel pain emotionally or physically in the name of love, because that is not what it is. So those are all the books I read in November, and this is the book that I said that I completely missed out on talking about. I read this quite a few months back, and that is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I gave this 5 out of 5. This is such a different book to what I'm used to, and I love the narrative, and I love the story, and I love the message of this book. And it is such intelligent writing, because you constantly have to read between the lines. That bigger picture that everybody keeps talking about in this book is incredible. Like, once it hits you, like, I was just, honestly, I think the word is profound, because the way he explains the meaning of your life and how important it is, how valuable your life is, it's unlike anything I've ever read. It's basically about this girl called Nora, who at the beginning of the story is like completely depressed with her life, and so over it she decides to kill herself. And I think in between life and death, she goes into this library called the Midnight Library, where it's basically a library with like an endless number of shelves, and on each shelf is a book of different choices that she could have made. All the what ifs in life. What if I made this decision, or what if I didn't make this decision, what if I took this path, all of that. So all the what ifs in her life, and she gets to see if she had made that decision, how her life would have turned out. And this concept of the Midnight Library, I feel like is a hyperbole to this hypothetical vortex that is inside your head. Because Nora herself, I wouldn't necessarily call her a character, because she's more of a metaphor or like a construct as to what goes in our head when we are at our most vulnerable, when everything becomes too much and you feel like there's no escaping this spiral inside your head that all you want to do is just end it all. Because Nora as a character, you can't really consider her to be one, because she never really gets to make any. This is not that type of story where she lives her life, she gets to make choices, she gets to meet people. This is all happening inside her head, and this is all a version of one person, but the overall idea and the concept of this midnight library is what you have to understand and take into consideration, when reading the book. And that is how, at least this is my version of it, this is how I perceived it as. The whole idea is that everything you do in this life, in this version of you, have meaning. All the choices you make, all the decisions that you take, they all have meaning. So instead of trying to live a different life or imagine or picture a different scenario or an alternative universe where you are happier or like more satisfied, you learn to appreciate and understand how important you are as an individual and as a person once you finish this book. And I feel like that's the message. So instead of trying to live another version of yourself, think about what they might be doing. You learn to appreciate and understand everything that you do in this life have value, because that's the life that belongs to you. Because that's one of the reasons why she could never be happy in any of the alternate lives that she got to live. Because the idea of the library is once she finds her perfect life, she gets to stay. But she could never do that because all the lives that she got to live in were not hers. It was just another version of her. That is why she enters these different lives as her root self and not that version in that universe. Because it's only that life that she gets to live in, because the other lives are not hers, they're a different version of hers. All our lives, what we constantly do is we try to always make our lives better. We always think, what can I do to make it better or make things better? How to change who we are in order to be better. And I loved how the writer deals with this construct of self by using the many worlds theory. Because the reality is there's no right or wrong way to live. Because the choices you make in this life, you make them for a reason. And what the story shows is that there is no one like you in the multiverse. Not even a different version of you is you. So there's just only one. So just think about that for a second. Like in this entire universe and the multiverse, whatever you believe in, there's only one of you. And not even like your different versions can replace you, because there's just only a parallel version of you. So all of that she discovers through, like, one of the things I know a lot of people had a problem with is the fact that the story kept getting repetitive, because she constantly tried different lives and different scenarios, and we got to see all of that. For one thing, I didn't have a problem with it. I mean, I had a problem with it in the beginning, but once I finished the story, the end of the story made more sense and a lot more valuable with that setup in the first half, where she gets to experience different lives, so that you know how frustrating it is, and you're always thinking like, okay, what's the point? We get it, you're not happy. You realize what the author is trying to say after like 2 or 3 lives that she experiences. Okay, the idea is that you're never going to be happy in any of these other versions. So, but the idea of the story is not for you to figure out what's going to happen, right? Because it's not that type of story. It is to sort of realize and appreciate the version of you that is reading this book and that is living this life, who made the decision to pick it up. And just all of these things, all these decisions that you make, they have value, they have power, it makes you who you are. And so the construct of identity and self is so important, and that is why this book was incredible to me. Like, reading it made me feel like I'm one person in a multiverse and there's no one like you, there's no one like me. So of course that is the message of the story, and that's what the character discovers as well. And she goes back to living her life, she gets a second chance at life, I would say. And it's not like she gets over this, like this depressed, like she was depressed when she killed herself, right? So she's not gonna magically be cured when she goes back to her life. What they show is that, like, she still is, her apartment is still a mess, she still considers it to be very dark and gloomy and depressing, and she was still seeing her entire life the way she saw it before. The only thing that changed is that she appreciated that it was her life, her own. It was such a great read. I didn't think I would connect with it the way I did, because it just felt like another book that I'm reading. But after reading it, I definitely want to pick it up again and read more of Matt Haig's books, because I like his genre-bending style of writing, where he incorporates like the scientific elements into your normal fiction. So definitely pick it up. It's a great read, and and learn to appreciate yourself, because you won't get another life where you get to be you and be loved for being you. And that is all the books I read, guys, in November and a few months back. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in my next video.